All right, so Joe Rogan, arguably one of the most popular and influential podcast hosts in the entire United States, recently came out and basically gave his somewhat tacit endorsement of Ron DeSantis to be the next president of the United States. So let's go ahead and jump into this clip, and then I will give you guys my thoughts on it.
Yeah, so all this stuff is happening while we have a dead man as a president.
Yeah.
You know, it's just
Are you throwing out any
it's not fun.
Any support towards anyone, or are you going to hold off and because I know, didn't Elon Musk come out recently for DeSantis?
Yeah, I think Ron DeSantis would work as a good president. I mean, what he's done for Florida has been admirable.
Look, I feel like I'm doing breaking news right now. That wasn't even on purpose.
I feel like what he did for Florida, a lot of people gave him a lot of grief, but ultimately he was correct. He was correct when it comes to like deaths. He was correct when it comes to protecting our vulnerable populations. He was correct in terms of distribution of monoclonal antibodies, and he was furious when the government tried to pull those. They were trying to pull very effective treatments. You know, he is not perfect. He's a human being, but what he's done is stand up for freedoms. And people think that so there's some weird gaslighting shit that went on where people equated freedom and saying the word freedom to like right-wing bigotry and hate. It is so strange.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, obviously. Number one, the thing that he said at the beginning about Joe Biden being basically a dead president, that is 100% correct. Other than that, I pretty much disagree with every single thing that he just said in that clip. So much to get through. Number one, on the COVID shit, I mean, maybe you could make an argument that Ron DeSantis was pushing for like monoclonal antibodies and other treatments to be more widely available. Sure, that's great, that's fine. But in terms of like his broader approach to COVID and the complete failure of Florida, I mean, it was literally one of the worst states in the entire country in terms of their response, the amount of deaths that they had in Florida, the way that they were counting their numbers. So just to give you a little bit of a picture here from the Miami Herald, they say Florida undercounted COVID cases and deaths and failed to get test results, a state audit said. So they're number one, obviously not doing it too well in terms of keeping up with the death count or even, you know, pretending to care about it. But number two here, just to give you a mindset in terms of what his strategy was, Florida Surgeon General blasts the testing psychology around COVID-19. So taking a brave and bold stance here, coming out against one of the most like basic aspects of pandemic protocols and testing people and keeping track of who has the disease that we're talking about. But I mean, he literally said we're going to be working to unwind the sort of testing psychology that our federal leadership has managed to unfortunately get most of the country in over the last 2 years. So straight up coming out against testing, and this kind of ties into the whole monoclonal antibodies thing, is like to the extent that Ron DeSantis was pushing for treatments for COVID that would only be used once you get COVID and then end up hospitalized, or maybe right before you end up at the state where you have to be hospitalized. The whole reason why he was pushing that and putting such an emphasis on that was so that they didn't have to take any basic measures or put policies in place in order to prevent widespread spreading of COVID in the first place and to prevent people from getting the disease. He was very, vehemently anti-mask in every way, shape, or form, wasn't aggressively like pro-vaccine in any way, shape, or form. And so, the treatments are only like one tiny aspect of responding to a pandemic. So, if you're going to pick and choose which strategies that he was putting in place there, then you're going to end up with like a warped picture of exactly what COVID has looked like throughout the duration of the pandemic. But really, just to put it in full perspective here from a data that was collected by New York Times, they say here's a breakdown of average daily COVID-19 deaths and COVID-19 deaths per 100,000 people over the last 7 days in all 50 U.S. states and Washington. This was last updated on June 29th, and this has been pretty consistent throughout the entire pandemic. I mean, Florida is sitting here at number 2, only behind West Virginia, another conservative state. But Florida, deaths per 100, you're sitting at 0.25, daily average deaths still 53. So, I mean, listen, this is just within the most recent time period, but if you want to go and look at the total death count within Florida, I mean, it's massive. It is gigantic, and it's not just because Florida is a large state, it's because they didn't even really pretend to try to, contain the pandemic in any reasonable capacity. But that's just going on the COVID shit. Imagine, all of the other things that we could talk about in regards to Joe Rogan claiming that Ron DeSantis believes in freedom. I mean, what the fuck does he even mean by freedom? And he pointed out at the end of that clip that he thinks that there's been some gaslighting, I guess, surrounding the word freedom, and I guess leftists or woke SJWs in Joe Rogan's mind are out here saying that the word freedom is like inherently bigoted or something. I haven't really seen what that is, so I'm not exactly sure what he's referencing, but in terms of like why people would maybe think that that word has some association with bigoted people or ideologies is because that is the same type of rhetoric that conservatives are using all the time in order to justify massively bigoted shit. And so we're going to get into a couple different examples here of exactly how Ron DeSantis is not in favor of so-called freedom and how that ties into a lot of those bigoted allegations. But just to start us off here in terms of running through the policies of what Ron DeSantis represents or would represent as the president of the United States. I mean, keep in mind before we go through a list of these policies that Joe Rogan was somebody who supported Bernie Sanders, okay? He endorsed Bernie Sanders 2 years ago. 2 years ago, he had him on his podcast and was agreeing with like 95% of what Bernie had to say on Medicare for all, on the Green New Deal, on taxing the rich, on protecting unionization, and all of these other different leftist core policy beliefs Joe Rogan was agreeing with him on. And so, you know, when it comes down to it, my main takeaway from this, as I've said before in live streams and on this channel, is that it doesn't seem like Joe Rogan has any actual core underlying beliefs, because if he did, if he had actual principles that he was adhering to, then you couldn't possibly reasonably jump from supporting Bernie Sanders to 2 years later supporting Ron DeSantis, because on every single policy angle that you want to look at this, they're completely diametrically opposed. There is almost no overlap whatsoever between the policy agenda of a, you know, hypothetical President Bernie Sanders and the policy agenda of a hypothetical Ron DeSantis. They are on complete opposite ends of that spectrum. So again, the idea that Joe Rogan has any coherent ideology seems like it's one that is, you know, false. I mean, I think this is partly a product of all of the different people he's been having on his show recently. I think he has a good ability to pull a lot out of the people that he's interviewing. He can basically adapt really well depending on who he's talking to, but that also has its downsides, because basically what he does is just invite on mostly disproportionately conservatives now, and just, you know, disingenuous pundits and etc., and basically just pulls them on his show. And if that's all you're talking to and that's all your content is about, then you're just going to get dragged to the right, because you don't have those core principles that you are latching onto in terms of like policies and, you know, actual ideological approaches to these problems that you want to see implemented. But just to start us off here with one of Joe Rogan's main flagship career-long policy beliefs, legalization of marijuana. So you want to talk about freedom and how Ron DeSantis supposedly supports freedom. Well, here on the marijuana issue, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis says marijuana should remain criminalized because it's putrid odor. So he wants to continue the war on drugs, the failed war on drugs, which has led to the, you know, crisis of mass incarceration, has led to countless people, thousands and thousands of Americans being locked up, having their lives completely destroyed for the crime of using a drug that does absolutely no damage to really themselves or anyone around them. So he wants to continue criminalizing marijuana along with all of the other drugs that you could talk about in a context of a discussion surrounding legalization or decriminalization. So, you know, real supporter of freedom over here. But move on to the next one. DeSantis proposes adapting to climate change without doing any left-wing stuff. So not exactly what the fuck, not exactly sure what the fuck he means by this. DeSantis proposes, tackling climate change without doing any left-wing stuff, because basically any of the actual policies on the table in terms of meaningfully addressing climate change are coming from the left. You have things like the Green New Deal, which I would think would be something that Joe Rogan would be in favor of. You're tackling climate change. You're creating millions and millions of good-paying union jobs in the renewable energy sector for the future. You're investing in domestic manufacturing, etc. Would be amazing for the economy, would be amazing from a freedom point of view if you want to look at it from that angle, and supporting unionization, but also would actually meaningfully prevent a lot of the incoming disastrous effects from climate change that somebody like Ron DeSantis would be perfectly fine with accepting. So that's just on climate change. I'm not sure how Joe Rogan feels about that right now, but complete fucking joke. Moving on to the next thing here from Truth Out, they say, in blatantly fascist move, Florida GOP passes a bill to form election police force. An election police force. So feeding into the same, 2020 election was stolen conspiracy lies that were pushed by Donald Trump. This guy is really trying his best to do a Donald Trump impression. You can even see it in the various hand motions that he does at his press conferences now. So, I mean, he's following exactly in Trump's footsteps. And if anything, you could definitely make the argument that he's just a more efficient and less, annoying online version of Trump. He's a much more dangerous version of Trump because he is much more able to effectively get his legislative priorities passed past. And so, if you don't like Donald Trump and you don't like the policies that he stands for, then why the fuck would you like Ron DeSantis? I mean, let alone move from being a Bernie supporter to being a Ron DeSantis supporter. Just completely inconsistent. And again, not exactly something that screams freedom lover to me. But we continue here with another article from Common Dreams. Sounds like fascism. DeSantis signs law to collect political views of professors and students as well on college campuses. So again, this ties into other things that he's been doing in the education sphere, like this one. DeSantis signs a bill for Florida students to learn about the victims of communism. He established a Victims of Communism Day in the state of Florida. Basically just an entire day dedicated to doing anti-communist propaganda, okay, instilling nationalist, right-wing, patriotic education within the state of Florida. This is what he wants to see. He doesn't want to have any, discussions surrounding critical race theory or the history of slavery and Jim Crow laws, the racist institutions that we still have baked within the United States right now to this day. He doesn't want to have any conversations about the history of slavery, the history of racism in the United States. He only wants to have an education system where they portray capitalism as the greatest success of humanity and the United States as a perfect good that has never done any evil. So, this is another area where it doesn't really sound like he is in favor of, of free discussions of a lot of these different ideas. But finishing off here with another move that he made on education in the state of Florida. Here from the Washington Post, they say, he has, among other things, limited what teachers can say in the classroom about race, gender, and other topics, and appointed anti-public education figures to his administration, including a QAnon supporter and, as education commissioner, an employee of a charter school management organization. He has also legally empowered parents to sue school districts as part of his parental rights initiative, and micromanaged and limited the power of local school districts. And finally, they say DeSantis and his like-minded compatriots make no secret about wanting to privatize public education, arguably the country's most important civic institution. Their school choice movement means expanding alternatives to public school district. They include charter schools, which are publicly funded but privately managed, as well as a voucher and similar programs that use taxpayer money to pay for tuition and other costs at private and religious schools. And these schools can legally discriminate against LGBTQ and other students and adults. So again, that's just a little bit of a perspective in terms of his domestic policy agenda. Anti-marijuana, wants to continue criminalizing that. He wants to basically just do completely nationalist education within our education system. He wants to form election police forces that are, going to be cracking down on the non-existent problem of widespread voter fraud that would affect the outcomes of elections. He wants to teach anti-communist propaganda, etc. So many different things, and I'm sure that I'm missing out on a lot of his other, policies that he has deployed recently, but I'm just trying to give you guys a quick rundown through exactly why it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to support Ron DeSantis after supporting things that Bernie Sanders wanted to see for this country. So just to finish off here in terms of his foreign policy and what you could expect if he was the president, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis calls out Colombia's Gustavo Petro to stoke leftist fears among voters. The rising star in the Republican Party spoke about what he saw as the rise of totalitarianism and Marxism in Latin America. So he's talking about a democratic election of a leftist candidate, Gustavo Petro. He's not even, necessarily some crazy communist or Marxist or anything like that. He's really more of like a social democrat kind of guy, but he won this election in a completely free and fair way, even to the point where his opponent, who was, just as a reminder, Rodolfo Hernandez, who was literally comparing himself to Hitler, okay, that guy conceded the election. He said it was a free and fair election. Gustavo Petro was a rightful winner, and you had the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, coming out and opposing his win and saying this is an example of the rise of totalitarianism and Marxism. So again, really, in favor of free and fair elections very clearly here. But listen, at the end of the day, okay, the reason I'm making this video is because Joe Rogan has massive influence from his platform, and it seems like at this point, I don't understand how anybody could possibly come to the conclusion that he even has any underlying core policy beliefs, because even when you want to touch on something that is something that he's been very consistent throughout his entire career, something like marijuana legalization, I mean, do you just not know anything about Ron DeSantis? Do you not know anything that he stands for in terms of policies? Because I'm sure if you laid out, without listing who was crafting these policies, if you laid out Bernie Sanders' policy agenda and you laid out Ron DeSantis' policy agenda and you gave him 2 sheets of paper, he would pick the Bernie Sanders one probably 9 out of 10 times. But I mean, either he doesn't know what Ron DeSantis stands for or what he's been doing, or he's had this massive rightward shift over the last couple of years, and maybe that's the case. But honestly, at the end of the day, I mean, I'm left with the same conclusion that this guy seems like he's like a ball of clay, basically, as a political commentator, as an interviewer, as a podcast host. He's just a ball of clay that can be molded into whatever political ideology the person that he has on his show at any given time is espousing at that moment. So, it doesn't really seem like he has any coherent policy beliefs. It doesn't seem like he has any coherent ideological framework.